They laughed at first. German officers, confident in their steel war machines, scoffed at the reports. Soviet women flying outdated biplanes? Wooden frames, canvas wings, engines quieter than tractors? It sounded absurd. A bad joke passed around mess halls between glasses of schnapps. They even gave them a name, not out of respect, but ridicule. Nachthexen, they called them. Night witches. The nickname was meant to mock, to reduce them to folklore, to make the German troops feel less threatened when something invisible began haunting their outposts. But soon, that name took on a weight that sent shivers through the trenches. Because the night witches didn't just fly, they hunted. This is Ghosts of WWII, where we do more than remember, we honor. If the name Nachthexen stirs something in you, if your grandmother or great-aunt ever served, or if you just respect courage in its purest form, subscribe, share her name in the comments below. Because this story, it's not just about flight, it's about defiance and the silence that fell after the bombs. It began in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, was in full motion. German tanks tore through Ukraine, Belarus, and deep into the Russian heartland. The Red Army was reeling. Resources were scarce. Morale was worse. But in the shadows, a different kind of unit was forming. Marina Raskova, a Soviet pilot often referred to as the Russian Amelia Earhart, proposed something radical: all-female air regiments. Not support staff, not clerks, combat pilots. It wasn't an easy sell. Many Soviet generals, though desperate for manpower, didn't believe women could handle combat. But Stalin, sensing both propaganda value and practical need, approved it. The result? The 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They were volunteers. Most were in their teens or early 20s. Some had barely flown before. They trained in freezing fields with outdated equipment and slept in tents beside their planes. They learned to assemble bombs by hand, chart courses with pencils, and take off from dirt roads by moonlight. Their aircraft? The Polikarpov PO-2. It wasn't a warplane, it was a crop duster. Wooden frame, open cockpit, max speed around 100 miles per hour. It could be shot down by rifle fire, no armor, no radio, no parachute. But what it lacked in power, it made up for in stealth. When the night witches cut their engines and glided silently toward German encampments, the only warning was a faint swooshing sound, like a witch's broom through the dark. By the time the first bomb exploded, they were already gone. At first, the Germans didn't know what was happening. Explosions in the night, no warning, no planes on radar, just craters in supply depots and flames licking the edge of fuel convoys. They mocked the night witches, called them a propaganda stunt, said they weren't real soldiers. Just girls with toys, some said. But the soldiers in the trenches started telling different stories about how the witches came in threes, 2 flying as bait, drawing the spotlight and anti-aircraft fire, while the 3rd flew dark, silent, and low. About how they'd circle back after the all clear, dropping a second wave of bombs when men thought it was over. About how the explosions always hit something vital: the ammo, the fuel, the maps. By late 1942, the laughter had stopped. Field commanders issued standing orders. If a German pilot shot down a night witch, he was to be awarded the Iron Cross. Not because it was hard to hit the Po-2, but because it was nearly impossible to catch them. The Po-2s flew so low and slow that modern German fighters often overshot them. Some Luftwaffe aces refused to even engage. It was too risky. And yet the night witches didn't have it easy. Their missions were brutal. They flew 8, 10, sometimes 15 sorties a night, in open cockpits, in the dead of winter, with nothing but scarves to shield their faces. When flak burst near them, Wooden splinters tore into their bodies. When they crashed, there were no recovery teams. And when they died, there were no headlines. But they kept flying. Because to them, this wasn't just war. It was vengeance. The Nazis had burned their homes, killed their families, marched through their towns. Every bomb they dropped was personal. Every German base they hit was one step closer to reclaiming their homeland. They wrote love letters on their bombs. They painted the tails of their aircraft with stars. They braided their hair before takeoff, not out of vanity, but so their comrades could identify them if they went down. One pilot, Yevdokia Nosal, flew over 500 missions before being killed in action, still gripping the control stick as her plane disintegrated. Another, Nadezhda Popova, was shot down multiple times and kept flying. She once completed 18 missions in a single night. These women weren't legends, they were real. And the fear they instilled in German troops was just as real. One Wehrmacht report described maddening nerves caused by the sound of Po-2 glides at night. Soldiers fired blindly into the sky, exhausted and paranoid, morale dipped. Officers wrote that the enemy did not sleep, that the witches were always watching. And one night, near a supply base outside Rostov, the mocking ended entirely, because a regiment of night witches dropped their bombs, then circled back. The base, lit up thinking the raid was over, exploded in a second wave of fire. Ammunition bunkers, fuel trucks, command posts, all gone. Survivors said the flames could be seen for miles. No one laughed after that. By the spring of 1943, the 588 had become a whisper in the wind and a storm in the dark. Their missions multiplied. So did their reputation. In Soviet high command, senior officers began referring to them not as a novelty, but as an elite tool. They were assigned more critical targets: supply dumps, bridge crossings, rear command posts, any place the Germans felt safe. They weren't safe for long. The night witches developed their own rhythm, a cadence of destruction that was as psychological as it was physical. They'd approach silently, engines cut, gliding just above the treetops, the sound of the wind through wires sending chills down the backs of seasoned troops. Then, impact. Sometimes it was a single bomb, sometimes several. Then silence. Then, the return. By the time the Germans reoriented their defenses, the witches were circling back for another drop. Even when nothing exploded, fear did. German soldiers began hallucinating the sound of incoming planes. Entire units fired at the sky in a panic, wasting ammunition, exhausting nerves. Commanders started rotating out entire battalions, not because of losses, but because of fatigue. The stress was relentless, but for the witches, the stress was their fuel. Each mission began in darkness. Their airfields weren't much to look at, rough strips of dirt or frozen tundra. No hangars, no floodlights, just the hiss of wind and the low murmur of voices as flight crews readied the old Po-2s. Ground crews were often other women, teenagers, grandmothers, nurses by day, mechanics by night. Together they loaded bombs by hand, checked rigging, patched bullet holes with tape and cloth. Then came the climb. Wearing padded flight suits and wool scarves, the pilots stepped into cockpits that were nothing more than wooden seats with a dashboard. No insulation, no heat, just dials and wind and mission orders. Each sortie meant flying over enemy territory, often alone, with only a compass and a map drawn in pencil. No radio, no GPS, no margin for error. But they didn't complain. They joked. They gave each other call signs, some fierce, some funny. They scribbled poems on bombs. They shared chocolate if they had any. And when a pilot didn't return, they mourned her in silence. They folded her scarf. They flew again the next night because mourning had to wait. There were still bridges to collapse, roads to crater, fuel lines to burn. and the Germans were adapting. They deployed flak towers, searchlights, and patrols specifically for low-altitude defense. They changed convoy routes. They began using decoys, fake airfields, fake tents, trying to bait the witches into wasting payloads. But the witches learned faster. They studied shadows. They read patterns. And more than anything, they trusted instinct. One pilot, Irina Sabrova, became known for dropping bombs without looking, purely by feel and timing. Her accuracy rate was near perfect. She flew over 1,000 missions. Another, Rufina Gasheva, survived multiple crashes. Her logbook read like a war poem: sortie, return, repair, fly again. These women didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as necessary, and that belief carried them through every second of terror, through the tracer fire, the stall-outs, the nights when they flew so low they could see German soldiers' faces before the bomb released. Because they knew what the war had taken, and they weren't going to let it take more. In one mission near the Kerch Peninsula, a night witch squadron flew through a thunderstorm, using lightning as cover. German searchlights couldn't track them through the clouds. When the storm passed, 3 fuel depots had vanished in a sea of flames. No Soviet fighters escorted them. No newsreels covered it. But the flames, they lit up the sky like fireworks for ghosts. Even back at base, the witches weren't safe. German intelligence eventually caught wind of their field locations and began launching artillery raids and sabotage attempts. Some airstrips were bombed, tents destroyed, crews killed while sleeping. Still, they flew. One night, a pilot named Yekaterina Ryabova landed her Po-2 with the wing on fire. She refused to bail out, not because of pride, but because her navigator had lost consciousness and couldn't jump. She landed blind, dragged her crew out, put out the flames with her jacket. The next night, she flew again. These weren't legends created after the fact. They were known then. By 1944, the Night Witches had racked up over 20,000 sorties. They dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs. They crippled dozens of supply chains. Entire German units were reassigned to hunt them, and still failed. And their impact wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. They became the living embodiment of Soviet resilience, of what a nation under siege could do with nothing but willpower, plywood, and a reason. German morale, once a steel wall, began to crack. Reports from the front mentioned unnatural fatigue, exhaustion without cause, and sleep disorders. Doctors couldn't explain it, but the troops knew. It was the witches. Because when you fear the night, the war doesn't need to kill you, it already has. By late 1944, the war had shifted, and so had the Night Witches. No longer considered a curiosity, they were now a critical component in Soviet offensive strategy. As the Red Army advanced westward, recapturing territory inch by bloody inch, the witches followed the front lines, moving their makeshift airfields again and again, often sleeping beside their planes on frozen ground. But with their rising reputation came rising risks. The Germans knew them now, feared them, and they began planning around them. Night patrols were doubled. Anti-aircraft emplacements were hidden along anticipated flight paths. Decoys became more sophisticated. Fake command posts, fake vehicle convoys, even fake heat signatures built to lure the Po-2s into wasted drops. And yet, it didn't stop them, because the witches had adapted too. They were no longer just pilots. They were tacticians. They flew lower, slower. They learned to ride the tree line, using natural cover to evade detection. They dropped leaflets first to provoke a reaction, then bombs when the Germans revealed their real positions. They learned to listen for silence, to identify traps not by what was heard, but what wasn't. And when weather grounded most of the Soviet Air Force, the witches flew anyway. Through sleet, snow, crosswinds that should have shattered their wooden wings. They flew through fog so thick they couldn't see their own landing strips. They flew in moonless skies, using only river glints and forest breaks to navigate. And with each mission, their legend grew. But legends don't keep you warm. They don't patch holes in your wings. They don't stop the bullet that finds your navigator. They don't bring your friend back after her engine sputters and you hear nothing but static in the dark. The women of the 588th lived that reality every day. Their faces were windburned, their hands calloused. Many suffered frostbite. A few went temporarily blind from snow glare. And yet, they never stopped volunteering for missions. Why? Because by now they weren't flying for the Soviet Union. They were flying for the ones who didn't come back. Every sortie became a tribute, a silent promise. You didn't die for nothing. We're still here. We're still flying. Their commanders began to notice something different in their eyes. Not fatigue, not even rage. Focus, like they'd stepped beyond fear, beyond pain, into a realm where the mission, and only the mission, mattered. There's a story from the Belarusian front. A German armored convoy had been spotted moving through forested terrain, shielded from traditional bombers. The witches were dispatched. They flew low, too low. One of the Po-2s clipped a treetop, lost part of its wing. The pilot, Olga Sanfarova, managed to level the aircraft. She stayed on target, released her payload, direct hit. Then she tried to make it back. The engine failed. She went down in a frozen field behind enemy lines. She was captured, executed 3 days later. Her crew didn't know. They waited for her. Then they flew the same mission the next night. Same flight path, same target. This was the mentality by 1945. Not survival, not fame, duty. And as the Red Army surged into Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Prussia, the witches surged with them. Their range increased. Their missions doubled. They began taking heavier payloads, strapping extra bombs to their wings, pushing the Po-2s to the edge of collapse. More than once, planes broke apart mid-air from the strain. But even then, something remarkable happened. The ones who survived the crashes would often refuse medical leave. They'd bandage their ribs, tape their hands, and ask for another plane. Because flying wasn't just their job, it was their identity. The enemy had called them witches to demean them. But in the end, it became prophecy. Because witches don't die easy, and they always come back when the moon is right. One German prisoner later confessed, "We heard them before we saw them, then we didn't see them at all, and then, boom. Our trucks were gone, our tents were fire. We called them witches because that's what it felt like magic. Evil magic, but the kind you can't stop. That fear, deep, psychological, soul-soaking fear, was the witch's real weapon. More powerful than bombs, more accurate than maps, because it traveled through whispers, through shadows, through the very air itself. And even as the Reich began to collapse, the witches kept flying. Not because they had to, but because they weren't done yet. By 1945, the Nazi regime was crumbling, but the war was far from over. Each kilometer gained came at a bloody price. Cities weren't just recaptured, they were exercised, cleared street by street, yard by yard, bomb crater by bomb crater. The night witches flew deeper into the heart of the Reich, Poland, East Prussia, eventually Germany itself. Their missions now targeted infrastructure critical to the enemy's last gasps: railroads, bridges, fuel depots, and rear command posts hidden in forests, castles, even monasteries. And that's when the witches took on perhaps their most dangerous mission yet. It began with intelligence gathered by Soviet partisans behind enemy lines. A key German supply base had been established in a remote area of northern Poland, tucked between wooded hills, away from conventional bomber reach. The Luftwaffe didn't expect the Soviets to find it, let alone hit it. They were wrong. The Night Witches were assigned the raid. But this wasn't a typical mission. It would require every plane available, a full squadron effort, coordinated sorties, split timing, staggered waves. It would take them across 100 kilometers of enemy territory, over heavily defended zones, and into a kill box surrounded by anti-aircraft emplacements. And the weather? Brutal. Sleet, heavy winds, moonless sky. Any commander in their right mind would have called it off. But the witches, they didn't hesitate. Not out of recklessness, out of resolve. This was the kind of mission that might end the war faster, the kind that could save thousands of Soviet lives on the ground. And more than that, it was a chance to strike at the core of the machine that had taken so much from them. So they launched. One by one, their Po-2s rose from the icy field, canvas wings trembling, engines sputtering against the wind. Bombs strapped under each fuselage, scarves tight, hands numb. They flew in radio silence, no formation lights, no chatter, just the wind and the dark. By the time they reached the outskirts of the target, German spotters had picked them up. Flak cannons opened fire, the night lit with white-hot shrapnel. One plane went down, then another, but the rest pressed forward. They cut engines, and they glided. Down, down, down. The first bombs hit the southern flank. Tents, fuel drums, half-tracks. Flames erupted. Alarms blared. German troops scrambled, unsure where the attack was coming from. Then Wave 2. The northern approach. More bombs, more fires. Ammunition caches exploded in a chain reaction that lit the night like day. Trucks ignited. The command post collapsed panic. One German officer later wrote in his report, "It felt like they came from the trees themselves, like shadows. They dropped the first bombs, then vanished. We never even saw them. Then they came back." The final wave dove in low, terrifyingly low. Po-2s skimming just feet above the ground, their silhouettes flickering in the firelight. The witches dropped their last payloads and pulled up hard, one barely clearing a burning supply truck. Another clipped a radio antenna, tore off part of her wing, and kept flying. Within 12 minutes, the base was gone, wiped out. One of the largest tactical rear targets of the German army in Poland had been turned to scorched earth by plywood planes flown by women the Reich had once laughed at. That laughter, it was dead now, silenced by the explosions, buried under rubble. And as the surviving witches returned, some with damage, some trailing smoke, some with tears frozen on their cheeks, they were greeted not with fanfare, but solemn respect. They didn't ask for medals. They just landed, stepped out, unbuckled, and started preparing for the next night, because that's what they did. One of the mechanics, too old to fight, but wise enough to understand, said quietly, "They came back like ghosts, no smiles, no tears, just silence, but the kind of silence that shakes you." After that night, German High Command issued new orders. All rear bases within range of the 588th were to be reinforced, camouflaged, or moved entirely. But the damage was already done. Supply chains broke. Fuel shortages worsened. Command coordination frayed. And for the first time, Hitler's inner circle began to admit, if only in private, that the end might truly be near. The Night Witches hadn't just dropped bombs. They had turned the air itself into a weapon, and in doing so, they had changed the shape of war. By the end of the war, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had flown more than 24,000 missions. 24,000 times, someone climbed into a wooden frame in the dark with a bomb strapped beneath them and said, "Let's go." Their planes were never upgraded. Their cockpits never reinforced. Their pay was less than male pilots. Their missions were longer. Their targets were harder. And yet, they kept flying. They bombed from Stalingrad to Berlin, from the steppes to the Black Sea, through snow, hail, thunderstorms, even sandstorms on the southern front. They buried their dead in silence. They patched bullet holes with canvas. They braided each other's hair before missions, not for vanity, but for identity. Because when you pulled someone from a wreckage, you needed to know who they were. That's what war was like for the witches. Intimate, cruel, unrelenting, and through it all, they became legends. But when the war ended, they weren't celebrated. There were no parades for the witches, no ticker tape, no headlines, no monuments. The Soviet Union, like many nations after war, was eager to return to normal. That meant women were expected to go back home, to give up uniforms, to stop flying. Some did, some didn't. A few stayed in aviation, becoming instructors or engineers. Many others were forced out, told that war was a phase, not a path. And yet, they carried on. In villages across Russia and Ukraine, in apartments in Georgia and Belarus, they lived quietly. Some became teachers, some raised families, some never spoke of the war at all. But others, they told stories to grandchildren, to neighbors, to curious reporters who'd heard rumors of women pilots who flew at night with no radios, no parachutes, no fear. Those stories began to spread, and slowly, decades too late, the world began to listen. By the 1980s, surviving night witches were invited to speak at veterans' halls. By the 1990s, they were featured in documentaries. Books began to appear, schools were named after them. Statues were raised, not many, but enough. The legend had come full circle. They had once been mocked as girls in crop dusters. Now they were honored as warriors of the sky. But they never let the praise get to their heads. One pilot, Yevgenia Rudneva, killed at age 23, left behind a letter that said, "I am not afraid of death. I fear only that I will not do enough." She did enough. They all did. And now it's our turn. Because these women, these witches, won't be with us forever. Their stories live in photographs, in fading medals, in handwritten letters tucked in drawers, and in the memories of those who still remember the sound of a Po-2 gliding through a cold night sky. That's why we tell their stories here at Ghosts of World War II, because if we don't, they disappear. They vanish beneath the noise of modern life. They get reduced to trivia. They become footnotes in someone else's history. But not here. Here, they are front and center. Here they fly again. So if your grandmother, great-aunt, or even neighbor served in the Soviet Air Forces, share her name. Post a comment, light a candle, tell someone, because that's how memory lives, not in stone, but in voice. And we will be their voice for every mission they flew, every sister they lost, every enemy base they turned to dust. They were mocked, they were doubted, but they flew anyway. And in doing so, they won. They weren't supposed to matter. That's what the enemy believed. That's what their own commanders feared. That a few women in rickety planes made of wood and canvas couldn't change the war, couldn't strike fear, couldn't shift the tide. But they did. Not with power, not with speed, not with superior technology. With resolve, with grit, with courage sewn into every scarf, stitched into every flight log, woven into every silent glide through the midnight clouds. They changed the war not because they had more, but because they gave more. They gave sleep, they gave warmth, they gave youth, and for 32 of them, they gave their lives. Today, most of the night witches have passed, but their legacy, still flying. It flies in every young girl who dares to take the stick, who sees the sky as a place not just of dreams, but of duty. It flies in every soldier who understands that precision is more powerful than brute force. And it flies here, through you. You who took the time to listen, to learn, to honor. Because when you watch to the end, when you tell someone else what you've learned, you become a keeper of memory, a guardian of ghosts. That's what Ghosts of World War II is about. We're not here for the views. We're here to carry the torch, for the ones whose names are fading from records, but not from history. For the ones who were told they couldn't, and did anyway. For the ones who dropped bombs, and never dropped their principles. They mocked the night witches. They laughed at the wooden wings. They joked about the girls with no fear. Until their base exploded, until their convoys burned, until their armies trembled at the whisper of wings in the wind, until they realized the witches were real and they were unstoppable. If this story moved you, share it. If it reminded you of a name, write it in the comments. If it stirred something inside you, let that be their legacy. You are not just an audience, you are an echo. Make it last. This is Ghosts of World War II, and the witches still fly.